So good evening. My name is Sean Fitzgerald and I'm the Member Services Manager for Netball Queensland. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we are meeting virtually this evening, and to the elders of these lands past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome anyone to the meeting who identifies as a First Nations person. I'd like to welcome everyone who is attending tonight to the Netball Queensland's 2023 Association and Club Development webinar series, and also to those people that are viewing the recording at a time after this. Netball Queensland has partnered with CPR Group, Netball Queensland's preferred provider of governance support for its member associations and their affiliated clubs, to bring this webinar series to you this year. Tonight's Governance, Incorporation and Committee session is the first session of 6 in Netball Queensland's 2023 Association and Club Development webinar series, running monthly between March and August. Tonight's session will be recorded, so if you're not comfortable with being part of a recorded webinar, I respectfully ask that you please leave the session and wait for the recording to be released. To ask questions, you can use the chat function, or with that, I will be checking the chat function. You may wish to identify yourself and the organisation you're representing or not. That's completely up to you. Please be mindful that because this session is being recorded, please do not refer to anything that may breach confidentiality, either commercial or professional, or any information you are legally bound not to disclose. So tonight, I will now present, tonight I will have the privilege of introducing tonight's presenter for the Association and Club Development webinar series. It's Steve Connolly from the CPR Group, and he'll be delivering tonight's session. Steve and his team at the CPR Group bring a wealth of experience and knowledge in governance matters to clubs and associations across the sporting landscape in community land. So like the previous webinars that have been held in 2023, I believe that this webinar series will provide Netball Queensland's community with a great deal of value for the benefit of netball in the Netball Queensland jurisdiction. So with that, I'll hand over to tonight's presenter, Steve Connolly. Steve, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Sean. I thought you were going to say, I will now present Steve Connolly to you, which you could certainly do. It's great sometimes when we've got a room full of people and none of them know me. Sometimes I get a clap at the start of the session. And I say, oh, well, good, my job here is done. So tonight's a little different format-wise from how the future sessions will be run. Future sessions will be run as webinars, so still in Zoom. For those of you who've newly downloaded Zoom for this evening, the good news is that you won't need to re-download it, but the sessions will look a little different, and there'll be a few different buttons and so on. But essentially this evening, you have the option to, as Sean said, mute and unmute. You'll all have been muted when you join. So to speak up, you can just unmute, or if you want to ask a question, you can pop the question in the chat. And thank you to those of you who've been introducing yourself in the little chat window. Feel free to continue to do so as the session goes on for anyone else. So welcome Jody, Kelly, Christy, and Katie for introducing yourself, and thanks Michael from Netball Queensland as well. So yeah, and to reflect further on what Sean said, really excited from CPR Group to launch this partnership. We have been working for around 25 years with netball clubs and associations and have thoroughly enjoyed our work to date, and are really looking forward to continuing to assist clubs and associations in partnership with Netball Queensland to achieve great things in an organisational sense, but also importantly to help you, the volunteers and staff who are responsible for administering this fantastic game in the state, to enjoy your roles a little more and hopefully to make your lives just a little easier. Also to mirror Sean's acknowledgement of country, I'm joining tonight from Cubby Country here on the Sunshine Coast, and would also like to formally acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the country on which we meet this evening. So as Sean mentioned also, this is the first session this evening. Tonight marks webinar 1 in the 2023 Member Association and Club Development webinar series. And this is one important part of this partnership between CPR Group and Netball Queensland. As well as the webinars, clubs and associations are able to access things like on-call governance advice and mentoring, help with preparing and running your AGMs, which can be a bit of a daunting process, and access to more comprehensive assistance with things like strategic planning, reviewing your constitution, conflict resolution, and so on. So recordings will be made available, and I'll give you the link to the page on our website where you'll be able to access the recordings as well as all of the resources from tonight's session and subsequent sessions as the series rolls out. So after each session, you'll in the days that follow, we'll make the link available as well as some resources, and I'll refer to the resources this evening. And I'm going to give you the link, not now, but at the end of the session, and you'll be able to do the modern post-COVID thing and scan a QR code to access the page and the resources, which are not there yet because I don't want you to be distracted from the session's content this evening, but will be made available in the next day or so that you can get on and download some of the templates and resources that will enable you to put into practice some of the stuff that we're going to be discussing this evening. So if you've got a question, don't leave it until the end of the session. Just either stick your hand up and there's a little raise hand button. Most people are pretty familiar with the online meeting process these days, or pop your question in the chat. Sean's going to keep a bit of an eye on the participants list and any hands going up, as well as the chat. And if there's any salient points that come up that Sean feels should be raised then and there, he'll call out and interrupt me, which we've agreed I'm very happy to be the case. The good thing about this meeting platform, rather than the webinar platform, which the future sessions will be delivered in, is that you can just turn your camera and microphone on to ask a question. And in future sessions, you'll be able to still ask questions, but it will be through the written chat function. So 1 of 6, this webinar series runs through until August, and there's a bit of a snapshot of the topics to come. I'll mention now, and I'll come back to this at the end of the session, the final webinar in this series, which will be Wednesday, 9 August. We're looking to showcase a handful of clubs and associations from across the state that have done great things. So whether things weren't really good and you've turned them around to put your organisation on the path to success, or whether you have been hit by some natural or other disasters and you've been able to recover and put in place resilience measures to protect yourselves next time. We're keen to share some of those stories, or even some outside the box thinking that your club or association has applied. The idea of the 6th session in the series is to share the successes of clubs and associations with others around the state, because it's all well and good for people like me to stand virtually at the front of this room this evening and to share ideas and to share some stories and anecdotes and hopefully some jokes, which probably won't make you laugh, as a word of warning at the outset. Nevertheless, I still think I'm funny, so I'll try and tell some jokes probably. But that only goes so far. If you can hear from clubs and associations that have actually achieved fantastic things, they've turned stuff around and they've gone from maybe facing some real challenges to then demonstrate success, it means so much more. And it also helps to demonstrate that you can actually become a successful business, which, as we'll touch on very shortly, is what all of your clubs and associations actually are. So because I've done some training and assessment certification, I need to begin the session by giving you a bit of an idea of what you hope to learn. And we really want to talk through the fundamentals of, exactly as the title suggests, what does governance mean? What does incorporation mean? What does it mean to have that little INC at the end of our club or association's name? What's the role of our committee? What should we be doing as a management committee, or as you might call it, a board, in ensuring the effective governance of our organisation? And we'll also touch on meetings, because in a lot of cases, meetings are not the reason that people got involved, yet here we are in a meeting online. So you've probably gotten involved for various reasons, and that leads us to my first question for the evening. And I'm really happy if any of you would like to pop a little note in the chat to answer the question: why did you get involved in your club or association as a volunteer? So in the vast majority of cases, people stick their hand up because no one else does, or they love their club or they love their association. They might have played netball, their son or daughter might be playing netball, and they felt that they could contribute something by sticking their hand up to volunteer. So now, you're not all speaking at once. I'm keeping a bit of an eye on the chat. Do feel free to pop any reasons that you stuck your hand up to get involved in there. But I'll share with you our underlying adage when it comes to our work with clubs and associations all across Australia. Jody's shared, I love my daughter who plays and I'm an auditor of clubs, so it was frustrating to not see it run properly. Wow, that is a fantastic answer. Thank you, Jody. Christy, to make it more streamlined, I've played for over 15 years and my kids also play. I've got a senior role in business, so I can certainly share my work skills. This is fantastic. I realized that all the fond memories I had as a kid in sport only happened due to volunteers, and I wanted that for my children. And I have an amazing president who is really hard to say no to. Excellent. All right, we're going to come to the role of the president a little later in the discussion. But and another said clubs couldn't start without a president. The club couldn't start without a president, so I took it off. Okay, yep. So a new club there. Awesome. This is fantastic kind of motivations for sticking your hand up. And I wonder, for those of you who stuck your hand up initially thinking that it might be somewhat enjoyable to volunteer and you saw others having a bit of fun, and then over time as the role evolved and maybe you took on more and more, maybe you stopped having so much fun. And we work a lot with volunteers who are the opposite of that word that you see on the screen, and they're not happy and they're burnt out, they're overworked, they're underpaid. And I want to quickly share with you our adage that underpins, like I say, all our work with clubs and associations in netball and also in other sports. So we believe that every volunteer can be a happy volunteer, and a happy volunteer is one who spends exactly the amount of time in their volunteer role or roles from week to week that they want to spend. So they're not spending, in their mind, an unreasonable amount of time as a volunteer. But most importantly, they are spending all of that time doing only the volunteer work that they actually want to do. They're not doing work that is outside the stuff that they stuck their hand up to do, or if they've taken extra roles on, they've done so knowingly and happily and without coercion, which is actually a word that is used to define volunteering from Volunteering Australia, that volunteering is, an activity that is entered into of one's own free will and without coercion, which I laugh because one particular respondent said, I have an amazing president who is really hard to say no to. But I don't really think that that's coercion. I think that that's just that you've got a meaningful relationship with and friendship with that president, and therefore it's you don't want to leave them in the lurch, which is, again, one of the really good fundamentals of good volunteer management is make good friends with your members. So when I say that we believe every volunteer can be a happy volunteer, a lot of people snicker and chuckle and say, that's impossible. I couldn't possibly be happy in my role. I've got far too much to do and not enough time to do it. So the idea that every volunteer can be a happy volunteer is further underpinned by the notion that you, as an organization, have to get some stuff right. And what we're talking about tonight is some of that picture. So we've got this model when it comes to good volunteer management that you want to get your culture right, and then you want to build the appropriate structure get the culture right where people want to help out, stick their hand up and provide assistance in a volunteer capacity. And then you build a structure in which people can understand their role and where they fit in the overall organizational structure. And then you nurture your volunteers so that they don't just become burnt out, overworked, but you collaborate with your volunteer team to provide support. And we're kind of sitting in the middle tonight. We're talking, a little bit about culture, but we're really talking about getting the structure of your organization right. And if we can do that, then it's going to go a long way, hopefully, towards easing the burden for some of you who I imagine might be somewhat unhappy, or at least at times unhappy in your volunteer role because you feel as though you're doing more than your fair share, and there are other people who might not be sticking their hand up to help out, which a word of comfort perhaps is that you're not alone. Every not-for-profit sporting organisation in the country, bar maybe a handful out of hundreds of thousands, have volunteers that are feeling a little in the lurch and feeling somewhat under-supported by their members. So you're certainly not alone. So there's a little bit of underpinning philosophy to start our discussion. Now, that brings us to this word governance. And governance was a buzzword about 15 years ago. There was a lot of focus from particularly state government in injecting funds into organisations to build the governance capacity of those sporting clubs and associations. And governance is, like I say, a word that is sometimes or ill understood. And I once had someone say, "Oh, I know what governance is. We've got 3 levels of governance in Australia, or 3 tiers: local, state, and federal governance." Say, no, we're not talking about governments. We're talking about governance. And what we mean by this is the way that your organisation is governed. Now, governance is different from management because governance is at the strategic level, whereas management might become quite operational. So governance in itself is not actually one thing. We see governance more like the spokes in the wheel of a bicycle. And each of those spokes in the wheel represents an important element of doing good governance. So that might be having a sound constitution that is compliant with the legislation, which we're going to talk through briefly this evening, but also aligns with contemporary principles of good governance and good business, because a lot of your constitutions are probably dated, difficult to read, maybe compliant, probably aren't if they're older than a few years, but they aren't founded in common sense. And often organisations operate outside the provisions of their constitution because the constitution is old and, for want of a better term, maybe a little bit crappy. So one of the spokes might be your constitution. Then you might have your legal obligations, and risk management might be another spoke. You might have another spoke, which is your meeting procedures and your insurance requirements, the way that you run your meetings, the way that you do succession planning within your committee, the way you write grants and sponsorship, and the way you do your budgeting. So you can see that these are all really important elements of running a successful business. And I keep using this term business deliberately, and I'll come back to that shortly. But if one of the spokes rather on your wheel on your bicycle when you were a child and you rode a bicycle with spokes like this, or maybe now, as still a cyclist, if one of your spokes pops out, the likelihood that one or more of your spokes is going to pop out increases. And if you lose a few spokes, the structural rigidity of your wheel, and therefore your ability to roll comfortably, safely, and efficiently down the road, is compromised. And the same is true in governance. If we allow some of these really strategically important spokes in our wheel of governance to be forgotten or to not receive sufficient attention, then our journey towards a successful future as a club or association can be compromised. And this is one of the fundamental shortcomings in most sporting not-for-profit businesses, is that we don't have a sufficient focus on the strategy. We don't have sufficient focus on our governance. Why? Because we are so often drawn into the day-to-day operational minutiae of dealing with people. Because a club, an association, is just that. It is a collection of people. And if you put a collection of people together, there are going to be some of those people that require more of your attention, time, and effort than others. And there will also be some tasks in that business that require more time, attention, and effort than others. And typically speaking, it's the operational tasks, getting the boys and girls on the court, getting the uniforms on their backs and the visors on their heads, and the umpires on the sideline that takes precedence over the short, medium, or longer term strategic direction of your organization. So we do quite a bit of work with a national sporting organization, a sport which is far smaller than netball. Nevertheless, they are a legal entity at the national level, and they have affiliated, zones and then clubs that sit beneath them. And this National Sporting Association, prior to COVID, flew their entire management committee to the one location several times each year for a management committee meeting. Now, their management committee is pretty lean. I think at the time they had about 30 people on their management committee, so really efficient, as you can imagine. And the management committee comprised 10 people who were executive members, and then 2 representatives from each of the 10 zones. So 30 people. And they would fly all of these management committee members to the one location several times each year, 4 times each year, and they would have an entire weekend of discussions which were operational. And they would focus on all of the fires that they needed to fight. This complaint here, and that injury there, and that insurance renewal here. And they got to the end of every one of these weekends, and they hadn't discussed what they should have been discussing for the entire weekend, which is the strategic direction of this national sporting organization. So we got involved in 2019, and we worked with them to transition towards placing at least some emphasis on governance. So the first half of Saturday was just strategy. And as soon as someone brought up an operational issue, it got parked. And it got hived off until either that afternoon or Sunday. So to start with, 1/4 of their weekend was all strategy. And then that grew to Saturday, and then COVID hit and they went to online meetings, and now they're saving tens of thousands of dollars each year instead of traveling to the one location to just meet online. And their board meetings now run for 2 hours, and they spend that entire 2, and they have a board of 7 members, not a management committee of 30 people. So they are efficient, they are on task, and that board focuses on governance. That board focuses on all of those spokes that I just mentioned, and they focus on strategically important elements of running their business. And they have divested or delegated the operational duties to other people who have experience and expertise in those relevant areas. So if this was netball, we might be talking about umpiring and coaching and canteen convening and merchandise and uniforms and all of those really important elements of running their business. But they are delegated to operational teams, subcommittees, or maybe staff. But what this does is it takes that operational burden from the people who should be realistically exercising the strategic thinking, and gives those jobs to, my apologies, I've jumped ahead there. It gives those operational duties to the people who are on the ground implementing those decisions. Now, I'm no dummy. I know that we don't have a sufficient number of people in all of our clubs and associations to create this separation and to have people who only sit in governance roles and other people who only sit in operational roles. In netball, we are experiencing a bit of a transition, particularly at the association level across the state, where more and more associations are recognizing the benefit of engaging some paid support. So that paid administrator, manager, whatever we call that person, they sit in an operational role. And that person, along with other teams of people who might sit on subcommittees or in designated volunteer portfolio roles, they assist with the implementation of the decisions that are made by the board or management committee. But some of the people who are on the board are also in those operational roles. And that's okay, because as I mentioned, I know that we are experiencing a decline in volunteerism at the same time that we're experiencing an increase in the compliance and reporting requirements for not-for-profit organizations like all of yours. So I do understand that we have that limitation, but what I can tell you from experience is that if we create this separation and if we create an organizational chart that clearly articulates that we have some people sitting in roles that are primarily focused on making strategic decisions, that empowers those people to focus on the right stuff during their committee or board meetings. And then we have people, some of whom sit above and below the line, and others who just sit in these operational roles, who can just focus on doing the doing rather than feeling as though they're being pulled from pillar to post. So this separation of your organization's governance from its operations aligns with the way that successful businesses operate. It aligns with the way that local government operates. It aligns with the way that Netball Queensland operates. We've got a volunteer board comprising elected and appointed directors, and they make strategic decisions and set strategic direction. They do the governance, and then they delegate the implementation roles to the operational personnel within the organization. So this can be a little confronting for some club and association volunteers who say, we need to have a big committee because those people are the only people that stick their hand up to do anything. And we colloquially refer to them as the SEPs, or the same 8 people in your organization. So Jody's just popped a question in the chat. Are you talking like president, treasurer, and secretary as governance? Yes, I certainly am, Jody. But I'm also talking about the fact that your management committee might comprise a couple of other positions. And often those positions in clubs and associations in netball are operational roles. So sometimes we also see a coaching convener, a canteen convener, a merchandise, uniform representative, and so on. So we see operational roles that are sitting above the line. They're sitting in the management committee structure. However, they're operational roles. Now, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And with some associations, and some of you, will know this because we've worked with you directly, we've worked with you to go from a management committee of maybe 12 or 13 positions and transition to a board structure with 5 or 7 board members. So yes, as Jody points out, that might be your president, your treasurer, your secretary, which are your 3 statutory positions. The secretary can be a management committee position, or it can be a non-management committee appointed position. So for instance, golf clubs will have a general manager, and often that general manager is also the secretary, but that doesn't give them the right to vote at board meetings, even though they'll turn up and typically take the minutes. But it's important to note that that transition is really important. And if your club or association is top heavy, and if you've got a management committee comprised of a lot of positions, and you think that some of those positions might be operational, get in touch with us. Reach out and have a chat with us about what the transition might look like if it's suitable for your organization to go through a transition to try and achieve more of this separation between the governance and operations. And the fundamental reason that we do this is to ensure that both our governance and our operations get sufficient attention, because as I'm sure that some of you will have experienced yourselves, and certainly as I've seen in my own experience, if we've got those operational positions sitting above the line and we've got a big management committee of 12 or 13 people, just like that national sporting organization that I mentioned, it's the operational stuff that takes all the attention. The governance stuff drops off the bottom because we're so busy on fighting the fires, on the stuff that is really important or even urgent today, takes our attention away from the stuff that's important for next week, next year, 5 or 10 years down the track.
Steve.
Yes.
What is the $64 question to get the people to transition from that operational mindset into that strategic governance role?
Great question. And some circuit breakers. So for that national sporting organisation, it was a commitment, a collective commitment amongst that 30 people that that we are not going to talk operations on Saturday morning. So obviously we're talking about clubs and associations that probably don't dedicate an entire weekend to a committee meeting, every couple of months. But some line in the sand that an organisation can draw that that leads to some agreement between the committee members that we are going to do we're going to do things a little differently from now on. And I suppose even to take one step further back than that, the first step is to admit that maybe we could be doing things a little more efficiently. Because often when we have this discussion, it'll be met with some resistance, and people will say, no, we can't reduce the size of our management committee because they're the people who do everything. They're the people who help out. So So it takes collective commitment, and some organizations aren't ready to make a change, and not every organization needs to make a dramatic change, but clearly documenting the separation of governance and operations will also help with succession. It will help to find people to take your role after you have had enough of doing it. And for instance, if we have a president, and I often pick on the president because, you know, they're the person who thinks they need to be there for every training and every carnival and every weekend of games, and they need to be in the canteen. But if the other members of your organization see the president doing all of that stuff, and subconsciously even they understand that it's because that person is the president that they're doing all of that stuff, what are the chances that anyone else is going to stick their hand up to become the president? Zero. No one else is going to want to take that role on. So if we create this separation, and if we have a president who also has 3 or 4 other roles, it becomes clearer that when that president's time comes that they want to take a step back, we don't just need to find one person. We need to find someone to take on president, and then we need to find someone to take on this role and this role and this role and this role. We're actually replacing them with 4 or more people, not just one. Sorry, Kim, I just missed a question of yours. We've been trying to get this structure to work for the last 2 years. Can't get anyone to do operations, so the board end up doing these roles as well, simply to get players on the court. Absolutely understand that this is a challenge that associations do face, because when people are sticking their hand up for a board position, there's an inherent commitment that they make, that I'm going to be at board meetings and I'm going to do my bit because I don't want to let the rest of the team down. So the importance of getting the structure right, the operational structure right, can't be understated. It is so imperative that we get that the support structure right. And Kim, I'll be really happy to chat with you about this, because I've got familiarity with your association, and I'm sorry to hear that that some of you are carrying the burden of more than just your own role. But I'll be really happy to connect with you separately, and I'll provide contact details at the end of the session so you can touch base with us directly. Okay. Let's move on to this thing that I keep talking about, the fact that your organizations are businesses. So I'm not going to ask this as a poll this evening, but when we're in person, this is one of my favorite questions to ask, partly because it allows me to give out some chocolates, but often I'm giving out chocolates because people give me the wrong answer, but it's the wrong answer that I'm looking for. So what does the term not-for-profit actually mean? A lot of people think that this term means something like we can't make too much money, we can't make too much profit, we can't have any more money at the end of the year than we started the year. You know, if we get up to a certain amount of money in the bank, we've got to give some away. None of that's true. The only thing that not-for-profit means is that your organization exists not for the profit of your members. You exist as an organization that should ideally, and in my opinion, must strive to make a profit year on year, because no individual can benefit from that money. Your members are members, they are not shareholders. So if your organization makes a profit, at the end of that year, those members cannot receive any of that profit. They can't share in those profits as a dividend. Rather, those profits need to be reinvested into the delivery of your services in line with the objects in your constitution. Now, that might be in the very next year, or it might be the case that you go 4 or 5 years of trading profitably, save up some money, and then do a project that you may or may not get some grant funding to support. But that money can only be reinvested into the delivery of your services for the betterment of, for the enjoyment rather, of your members. So that ideally should be a good enough reason to break down the misconception that we often get. Oh, you know, we're just a community organization, we don't want to make too much money. Sure. And I'm not telling you that your clubs or associations should arbitrarily increase your fees. But what you should do is make sure you're looking through the windscreen rather than in the rear view mirror. And I use that analogy for the treasurers amongst us, because the vast majority of treasurers with whom we work spend all their time looking in the rear view mirror. They spend all their time doing reconciliation and reporting and no time at all doing budgeting, looking through the windscreen. In your car, there's a very good reason that your windscreen is significantly larger than your rearview mirror, because to drive safely, you've got to look forwards. The same is true in a financial sense in your organization. Your board or committee should be conducting budgeting, and that budgeting should be zero-based budgeting, where you're not making your decisions based on what the club down the road is charging or what you charged last year, but you're looking at your expenses, your known expenses, and you are then budgeting to make sure you're generating sufficient income to cover those expenses, and ideally to trade at least somewhat profitably. Because if you don't trade profitably, it means one of two things: you lose money or you broke even. And you can only do one or other of those things enough years in a row before you run out of money altogether. So not for profit is very different from no profit. Not for profit only means not for the profit of your members. So hopefully that's a bit of a disruption to the thinking of some of your organizations, where typically in board and committee meetings, we hear resistance to making the right financial decision from an emotional standpoint. Whereas your costs of operating your business, your club or association, are going up. You all know this. Your insurance, your home insurance is increasing exponentially. The cost of fuel has increased exponentially over the last few years. Water rates, electricity, these are costs that are going up at far greater than CPI, and they are costs to your business. So therefore, if you don't pass on some of those costs to your customers, then your financial security or stability could be jeopardized. So it's really important to make sure that you recognize that your organization can make a profit, and that you should be striving to, even if it's at least a modest profit. Your organizations are incorporated associations. You've got a little ink after your name. An incorporation is an incredibly important thing. What it does is it creates an entity separate from your members. So your club or association is seen in the eyes of the law in exactly the same way that you or I are seen. Your club or association can own or lease land. It can have bank accounts. It can generate revenue and put that money into its bank accounts. You can sue and be sued as a legal entity. So in the eyes of the law, your incorporated association has all the powers of a person, and your constitution will probably say something similar to that. Now, the Associations Incorporation Act has recently undergone some significant change. So the Act was first enacted in 81. There have been several overhauls. The most recent prior to 2020 was 2007. So there was a big 13-year gap. And that meant that in 2020, when our state government passed the Associations Incorporation and Other Legislation Amendment Act, that it was quite sweeping changes that Act brought about. And really, we're trying to catch up to some of the other states and territories around the country. So some important changes that were passed by Parliament in 2020, some of which took effect immediately, and other changes have been rolling out over the subsequent years, and the final round of changes will take effect this June. So the changes on your screen are those that took effect immediately. They were pretty innocuous, and one of them, general meetings can use technology. What was happening in 2020, June 2020? There were a lot of organizations that needed to have online AGMs. So our legislation kept up with what was happening in the world around it, and that amendment was made. Some streamlining of the winding up process of incorporated associations, which hopefully will not be a consideration for any of us anytime soon. And there were some increases to the penalties, maximum penalties issuable under the legislation. Now, the second round of changes, this is where the big stuff came in. So in 2022, we saw these changes take effect. They were supposed to take effect in 21, but due to some delays and COVID-related distractions from the government's perspective, they took effect last year. So in Queensland, the duties and legal obligations of management committee members are now the same, essentially, as directors of a company. So they're the duties on the left of your screen there. And I'm going to touch on those briefly again shortly, but the really important one is the duty to prevent insolvent trading. Now, this relates back to what we were just saying. A lot of organizations that use the model rules have a provision that the fees for their organization, the membership fees, are set by the members at a general meeting, and typically that's the AGM. Now, because management committee members have a legal duty to make good financial decisions and to prevent insolvent trading, i.e. ensure that your organisation can pay its bills as and when they fall due, it doesn't make a lot of sense to give one of the biggest financial decisions that your organisation makes back to the members who are not accountable. They are not the ones who have a legal duty to prevent insolvent trading. Therefore, we recommend that your board or management committee should make that decision. You should be the ones to set membership fees. Why? Because the members elect you to make important decisions like that. And now you've got a legal duty to exercise fiduciary responsibility. You don't need a common seal any longer. You've always needed one, but you didn't need to use it. So there's a bit of an anomaly that's been tidied up. And again, an anomaly that your secretary must be at least 18 years of age. You got an underage person that wants to be your secretary, find another job for them. Don't let them go. But I've not yet met a teenager who wants to be a secretary of an incorporated association. Okay, the big ones then that are going to take effect this June are that any remuneration or benefits paid to committee members or senior staff and any of their relatives needs to be disclosed at the AGM. Now, this will include honorariums or free membership that you give to committee members, and also any remuneration, salary, wages paid to senior employees, which are defined as those who can have an impact on your association's financial standing or the decisions of the committee or board. So again, if you've got questions there, let us know. We're not yet certain exactly what that's going to look like in terms of the disclosure process, and whether we need to say our general manager is Steve and he earns this and his package includes this, this and this. I don't think that's going to happen. That would be really silly. And some industry bodies like Clubs Queensland have been consulting quite vigorously with the Office of Fair Trading, with the state government through this process to ensure that reasonable provisions for this disclosure are included and enacted or proclaimed by government later this year. And secondly, your constitution is going to need to have an internal grievance procedure that must provide for mediation. Now, if your constitution, as many of yours that are older won't, doesn't provide for this, then the model rules relating to these things will be deemed to apply. So if you want to be able to write your own and have your own provisions in your constitution, then it might be time to consider writing a new document. To be clear, you are not obligated by the law to write a new constitution or adopt a new constitution just because of these changes. However, if your constitution says one thing and if the Act says something different, the Act always prevails. It's therefore illogical, in our opinion, to have a constitution which does not directly accord with the provisions of the legislation. So if your constitution is outdated, then it might be a good time to consider reviewing that document and maybe adopting some amendments or even adopting an entirely new document. So what does your constitution typically comprise? It includes your objects, and the objects are the high-level reasons or purposes that your organisation exists. It's really important to have this right, because your organisations are income tax exempt. And there are three reasons. There are three boxes that you tick to get income tax exemption. You're not-for-profit, tick. Incorporated associations can only be not-for-profit. Secondly, you deliver sport, which is one of the specific services that you can deliver to get that second tick in the box. And thirdly, your income and expenditure relate primarily to the objects in your constitution. So it's important to ensure that your objects are accurate, because if your income and expenditure relates to a whole bunch of other stuff, then arguably your income tax exemption could be jeopardized. So it's important that your objects accurately reflect who you are, what you do, and are written at a high enough level to be interpreted to enable your organisation to do what it needs to do to deliver its services effectively. And typically your objects will have a catch-all at the end that says something like, to do all such things as are incidental or conducive to the above objects or any one of them. So you can go and run a Bunnings barbecue to make money to deliver the services which meet the objects listed above. Powers, as I mentioned earlier, your organisation has the powers of an individual. Classes of membership, really importantly, should tell us in your constitution who's allowed to vote at general meetings, including your AGM, and who's allowed to be elected to the management committee. So even if you call it even if you call it a board, under the Act, it's a management committee, which is why I keep using that term. Here in Queensland, that's the term provided under the legislation for the decision-making entity that is elected within your organisation. Discipline and grievances, as I mentioned, that's going to be a requirement come June this year that your constitution includes that. And if it doesn't, the model rules relating to that stuff will be deemed to apply. Your constitution will, or certainly should, provide some clarity as to what the makeup of your committee is. Now, we suggest including a degree of flexibility here so that if your operational situation changes and you no longer want to call a position a particular thing, that you should be able to make that change without changing your constitution. So what we typically suggest is that your constitution says we've got the minimum. So we've got to have a president and a treasurer. We've got to have at least one other. For most of you, that's going to be the secretary, which I mentioned earlier can either be a committee position or a non-committee appointed position, and any other members elected at a general meeting. Or you might specify that you've got some other positions. But if your constitution specifies positions by title, then you're obligated come each AGM to try and fill those positions. So if you've got a vice president role, or you've got a sponsorship coordinator role, or a grant writing role, some of those operational functions that we've touched on earlier that are sitting on your committee, maybe it's time to consider whether they belong, and you're struggling to fill them at each AGM. Maybe it's time to consider moving some of those roles into the operational area of your organisation rather than providing that they are governance positions on the committee. But again, flexibility built into your constitution there is a great thing because it enables you to make that change without having to review the constitution and send it to the Office of Fair Trading. Your constitution should outline some provisions for your meetings. Now you'll have meetings of members and meetings of the committee and maybe meetings of subcommittees. And I'll talk very briefly about that in a moment. And there should be some information on how your finances are managed and whether you have dual authorized electronic funds transfers. If you're still signing checks, call me, talk to me. We need to stop that. Checks are a pain in the backside and no one uses them in the real world. So if you're using them in your club or association, let's stop that. And some provisions for legal documentation and winding up, and the fact that if you were to wind up, you can't, just like when you're operating, you can't distribute profits amongst your members. If you wind up, you cannot distribute profits amongst any of your members, and that any surplus assets must be distributed to some other not-for-profit entity.
Hey.
Yes.
So we have some members that are based in New South Wales and would come under New South Wales legislation. Is there anything that you could mention or talk to regarding their requirements or what they need to look for in their? I know they have a similar act, but it's just what would they need to look for for their compliance?
Thanks, Sean. Very good question. And the good news is that we're playing catch up with particularly the southern states, including New South Wales. So no really big markers to point to in terms of significant differences. The duties of management committee members in incorporated associations in New South Wales are really those as listed on the screen. In terms of reporting requirements, some of the timeframes might be just a little different. So here in Queensland, for instance, you've got 6 months from the end of your financial year date, which might be 30th of September or 30th of June, for argument's sake. You've got 6 months from that date to have your annual general meeting. And at that AGM, you've got to present your financials to your members, and then you've got to report to the Office of Fair Trading. In New South Wales, that time frame might be a little different. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what that time frame is, but it's either 5 or 6 months. And in terms of some of that flexibility, in terms of the committee structure, things are quite similar between our incorporation legislations here in Queensland and New South Wales. So if anyone either online tonight or watching this recording is from an incorporated association in New South Wales, just get in touch. And if you've got questions about your specific situation and you'd like to send us your constitution to have a look at, to let you know whether it's compliant or not, or whether it aligns with good contemporary governance and business practice or not, and this applies both in New South Wales and for any of your clubs or associations here in Queensland, flick us your constitution, and we're really happy to have a look at it and come back to you with any guidance or suggestions for amendment.
To throw another cat amongst the pigeons, there may also be companies limited by guarantee under ASIC as well that may be within the netball community.
So certainly, so Netball Queensland made that transition, I'm going to get the timing wrong, but somewhere in the order of a decade ago, from incorporated association to company limited by guarantee. Companies limited by guarantee have a greater degree of flexibility in their board makeup, so they can have appointed directors, such as Netball Queensland, as I mentioned earlier, whereas incorporated associations, their management committee members must be elected at the AGM and they must be members of the organisation itself, whereas companies can have directors who are not even members. So there's some great flexibility there. Companies can trade interstate without needing to be an Australian registered body. Companies typically just have a greater degree of flexibility in their operations, and as long as things are specified in their constitution, while there are requirements of the Corporations Act, which is that administered by ASIC, as you rightly point out, Sean, there are, for not-for-profits, the fundamental principles are the same. No individual can profit. Yes, you can have paid staff, but no individual members can profit just by virtue of their membership from the organisation generating profits at the end of a trading year. And the same applies when that organisation is wound up. You can't be distributing money amongst any of the members, but it must go to another not-for-profit. The time frame for when you must hold your AGM within a company limited by guarantee is 5 months from the end of your financial year. And the reporting obligations are a little different with ASIC compared with the Office of Fair Trading. But again, like I say, the fundamental principles are very similar, and the legal duties of decision makers apply across the board now pretty universally. So you have, as a committee member, first and foremost, an obligation to act in the best interests of your organisation. You have, and therefore to put the organisation's interests before your own and before those interests of your friends or family members. A duty to act in good faith, which means making the decision that a reasonably careful and prudent person would have made in the same set of circumstances, given all the information that you had at the time. So often we'll make a decision and more information comes to light after that decision that identifies to us clearly that the decision probably wasn't right. But we didn't have that information. We didn't have the benefit of hindsight. So the duty to act in good faith is really underpinned by this premise that you think you're doing the right thing and making the right decision based on the information that you've got at the time. Again, similar to that, acting with reasonable care, skill and diligence and applying the skills that you've got, and even leaning on external advisors, accountants, lawyers, auditors, consultants who can provide guidance and support to you. Relying on that advice is a defense to getting in trouble yourself if something goes wrong. Not improperly using information or your position. And this includes treating confidential information as confidential. And often the lines can be a little blurred when there's not a proper induction for a committee or board member and they are new to a position and no one says, hey, when we have a discussion at a committee meeting, unless if we agree very clearly that you can share that information throughout the membership of our organisation, that stuff's confidential. Some organisations will have their committee and board members sign a confidentiality agreement or a new board or committee member agreement. If you want some guidance in those areas, let us know and we can provide some of that documentation to you specific to your needs. Because it's really important to ensure that you're not just catching people out for doing the wrong thing, but giving the information to them at the outset so that they don't do the wrong thing in the first place. Disclosing and managing conflicts of interest is a really big one. Making sure that if someone has a conflict of interest, and for instance, I own a business and I'm also on a committee and the committee is considering engaging the services of either my business or others, if I'm on the committee, I need to take a step back, declare a conflict of interest and get out of the room and allow the other decision makers to make that decision in my absence. Just because that interest exists or conflict of interest exists doesn't mean that the decision can't be made though. And indeed, my business might be selected in my absence. But again, it's important to acknowledge that what is a conflict of interest and what might be perceived a conflict of interest it can be a really important consideration. Thanks, Kim. Just saw the note that you've got to go, and I'm conscious that we're coming up to the 7:30 finish time. So I've only got a short little bit to go, and then we'll see if there's any other questions that come up. And of course, then that one that I touched on earlier, the duty to prevent insolvent trading. And this is a really, really important consideration. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly rocket through this because it's important as a fundamental kind of understanding of meetings that you've all got this clear in your minds. So according to the legislation, the minimum number of committee meetings that your organisation must hold each year is 3, no less than 1 committee meeting every 4 months. Now, for most of your organisations, that's not going to be particularly effective, having a meeting every few months, and you're probably more likely to be meeting around monthly. But if you have a couple of months off over the Christmas period, it's okay, and you're not breaking any rules. Even if your constitution says your committee meets monthly, the Act prevails. General meetings, you should have 1 general meeting, in my opinion, each year, which is your AGM. If particularly your association is having regular general meetings, there may be merit in considering moving towards a member forum format where there's no quorum, so whoever turns up can have the discussion, and we don't make formal decisions. And this relates back to the fact that your committee are accountable for the decisions that your committee makes, and they are equally accountable, all committee members, not the rest of the organisation's members. So I know that there are still plenty of associations around the state in netball where this regular general meeting schedule happens and club delegates turn up and have their say. That same approach can be taken, and it's vital that there be good connection between the clubs and the association and amongst the clubs as well. But the idea of taking away the formality of a general meeting and just applying the more meaningful engagement approach of a member forum, and maybe turning it into a social activity and having a barbecue or some connection on a personal enjoyable front, certainly in our experience can work really well. And if your association is still fining clubs for not turning up to general meetings every month, then that probably is cause to consider some other reasons underpinning that, rather than just issuing fines due to non-attendance. It's vital that we get that engagement, but it's so much more valuable than when people want to engage rather than turning up just to avoid a fine. Subcommittee meetings, then they happen as and when they're required. So often organisations really hate meetings, or people within organisations really hate meetings because they go for too long and they're very drawn out. So we will be providing some templates, which will be available at the link that I'm going to share with you in just a moment, for management committee meeting agendas and minutes, so that you can use those. And I know that some of your organisations will use online meeting management software like Process PA or Meeting Track, but at least you'll be able to use these templates to look and challenge whether your meeting process is hitting the mark, and that you're actually preparing for those meetings and making sure that the meetings run efficiently and you're getting the most value from the time that the volunteers are investing in those meetings. And again, like any of the resources that you'll be able to access from the link that I share in a moment, you are more than welcome to reach out and let us know if you have any questions about them. Okay, conscious of time, so I'm now going to do a bit of a wrap up and let you know that the second webinar in this series, we will focus on finances and risk management, and that will be on Monday, the 17th of April, again from 6:30 p.m. And that will be either Michael or myself. Michael is our managing director, and my brother, he tells equally crappy jokes, and is certainly one of our top governance nerds. Nerd is a term of endearment at CPR Group. And as you can see, there'll be a bit of a flow of sessions culminating in that 6th session, as I mentioned earlier. So what I want to do is just put the call out, and if your organisation thinks that you would like to be showcased in that 6th and final webinar in August, touch base with Sean and let him know and give him a bit of a spiel as to why your organisation has demonstrated some showcase qualities and why you would like to be included in that session. And what we'll do is we'll tee up a time for myself or one of the CPR group team to come and sit with you. We'll do a bit of an interview, we'll record that interview, and then that will be presented along with the others on that evening, and again made available as part of the recording of the webinar series. So it's not a huge impost. It'll probably take about half an hour of your time all up. We'll meet ideally, on site, or we can do it online for anyone who's a bit more remote. And it'll be great to get a bit of a cross section of clubs and associations, and some of those in the southeast corner as well as throughout the state, to demonstrate what's happening throughout the Netball Queensland landscape. So if you reckon that your club or association should be showcased, touch base with Sean and let him know. And finally, I'll leave this one up on the screen as we wrap up. This is the QR code that you can scan, which will take you to the web page on our site, where the recording from tonight, as well as all of the resources from tonight's session, as well as the future ones, will be made available as we roll those sessions out. It looked like Kim asked a question.
That was something else there, Steve.
Okay, no problems, and then had to head off. Cool. Yep, good.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the content presented this evening. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone here's been able to get something from it or pick something up for their organisation. And I'd like to thank all attendees for attending. As Steve said, the next session is Monday, the 17th of April. And from there, if there's nothing further from you, Michael, Wright, on this matter.
Nothing further, Sean.
Nothing from Michael. Steve, I'll throw it back to you to finalise tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sean. So I'll stick around and leave the session running for another few moments. If anyone does want to pop a question into the chat, feel free to do so. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you can feel free to do so, remembering the points that Sean made earlier about just avoiding any sensitive or confidential information. But if no further questions are forthcoming, I'll really look forward to catching up with some of you in person, online, on the phone. Just get in contact with us. The resources that are going to be shared at that link, as well as the website itself, have all of our contact details there. Get in touch with us. If you can't find our details, get in touch with Sean or the team at Netball Queensland, and they'll put you in touch. We are here to help, and we don't want anyone feeling unhappy in their volunteer role. So thanks again to Netball Queensland for the opportunity to partner, and we're really looking forward to helping you all achieve some great things throughout 2023 and beyond.